This is the Gang of Witches Ibiza Podcast, hosted by Jo Youle. Each new moon, we'll explore with our guests how to think globally and act locally with ecofeminism. Awaken all your senses. The spirit of the witches comes to your ears. The Sabbath is that way. Gang of Witches.
Welcome to the very first series of the Gang of Witches Ibiza Podcast. I'm your hostess, Jo Youle, and in this series, we'll be getting together each new moon to explore the ecological and social challenges the island is facing, like climate change and the warming of our waters, toxic waste and how we can dispose of it safely, and we'll be taking a look at how we can protect our largest and most sacred treasure.
A square meter of Posidonia, in terms of environmental value, is much more powerful and intense than a square meter of forest, and it's essential. That's what we call blue carbon. So nobody should anchor on it. We only should anchor on sand, and we really should value this amazing plant that is Posidonia.
That was Sandra Benveniste, Director of Ibiza Preservation, who will join us on our third episode of the series, where we'll be opening up conversations with other powerful women, like today's guest, Marijke Colle, and joined together through the lens of ecofeminism to rise up and protect our planet.
If you want to see the ecological struggles, you can say that we want to liberate nature from the profit-driven grip by multinational capital. So nature is exploited just like women are exploited and oppressed. And to free them makes it possible to aim at another relationship between human society and nature.
And on the first new moon of 2021, we'll dive into the lives of 4 female local farmers, bringing back the heritage seeds to Ibiza and also expanding our local food sources. Here's Gabrielle Gambina from Ibiza Produce, who will also be on that roundtable of women.
The women that we have on this island are really hard workers. Most of them are part-time farmers, so they're basically juggling a job with running their farm, plus distribution and sales of the product. So it's, determined women.
But first, let me set the scene. So I was invited to host this podcast for the Gang of Witches, Paris's favourite art gang since 2016. They recently created their coven up in the hills in the north of the island, where they hold art residencies and women's get-togethers. And while their French podcast lands each full moon, this podcast is your new moon local and practical take on ecofeminism. You can discover a little bit more about exactly what they do and who they are on their website, www.gangofwitches.com. So it's an absolute honour to be with you on this series to attempt to steer the conversation forward under the wings of ecofeminism, because having lived on Ibiza for 8 years, I jumped straight on the eco bandwagon when I first arrived to support Ibiza Preservation's Sandra Benveniste back in 2013 and help get that story out about the huge struggle that the island was facing with the oil drilling giants trying to find out if we were sitting on a little gold mine right in front of us. And as part of that storytelling and piece I filed for Newsbeat's BBC Radio 1, I'll never forget that feeling as I boarded the Rainbow Warrior Greenpeace ship as it docked in Ibiza town to interview the head of campaigning for renewables for Greenpeace Spain. And if I'm really honest, that is when I realised how much love I have for this island and how much I felt a responsibility to help try and protect it, or at least do the only thing I know how to do and make a little news piece for radio. Because when you move to Ibiza, it's because you fall in love with the island, and also because nature here reminds you just how good it feels to be connected to the earth, and we all have a job to do to make sure we're actually doing something. The nature this island has and still does manage to preserve, thanks to some seriously strong eco-warrior women who are looking out for the island's best interests, is, without doubt, for me, the number one reason I wanted to be part of the Gang of Witches project and podcast, because spreading a little bit of love right now is really important. But the plan with this podcast is to showcase not just what is being done, but also what an incredible network of women this island has and what still needs to be done, and how we can all get on board to really be held accountable for the way this island evolves from this moment on. So today we're going to dive into a chat with a lady who will give this ecofeminism ideology a little bit of background, because as a biologist and ecofeminist activist right from the get-go, Marijke Colle, who lives in Ghent and joins us live on the line, has really seen it all. Don't go away.
Gang of Witches.
I'm joined now on the line by Marijke Colle from Ghent in Belgium. Marijke, thank you so much for coming onto the very first edition of the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast. It's a pleasure to have you with us here on today's show.
My pleasure too.
So let's start off with what brought me to tracking you down. And that was an essay I found that you'd written about how feminism and the fight women face is the same struggle as that of our ecological battleground. Can you explain what exactly you mean by them being the same struggle? What is the connection?
The connection is that women are exploited in their invisible homework, care work in the family, non-paid care work which never ends, as nature is exploited by the economic system without taking into account any costs. Nature is for free, nature is unlimited, and nature performs services for us, not being paid. And due to the fact that nature is so-called unlimited, which is absurd because we are on one planet, but the resources of nature seemed unlimited in the 19th century and the 20th century. And so using and polluting water, air, and soil seemed to be something you could do for free. On the other hand, the whole mineral wealth of the earth has been exploited by industrialism. All kinds of ores have been taken out of the soil without taking into account the consequences for humans and for the landscape and agriculture. If you look into the old coal mine regions in Germany, in Belgium, in England, you see the remnants of that destruction of the landscape. You see the mountains of coal remnants still polluting the regions. You can see it in Wales also. And so you can see it now with the fracking, the way in America, North America, oil is taking out of layers of shoal by injecting all kinds of polluting things into soil just to obtain that extreme oil for the fossil fuel industry. If you look at agriculture, it's the same. Agriculture used to be an integrated activity by farmers and their families, raising cattle and other animals and growing plants. Today, agriculture has changed into a plantation economy and monocultures who also destroy the soil. So you have to add all kinds of chemicals to make that soil in an artificial way fertile again. So the artificiality and the technicality of it reminds us of what the earlier ecofeminists like Vandana Shiva said. She said there is a technological and male-dominated patriarchal attitude towards nature and towards women, quite similar. And her experience, Vandana Shiva lives in India, her experience was an experience with fertility control on women, because in the 1960s and 70s, there was this general fear of the population bomb. Overpopulation was going to drown the rich countries with hordes of migrants coming from the poor countries. And so the Indian government started, with the help of the Rockefeller Foundation, started population control. How did they do it? They involved the army, the Indian army, with trucks and mobile homes to scan pregnant women and to see if it was a boy or a girl. And when it was a girl, women chose to have an abortion because this gave them some money. And they underwent sometimes forced sterilization when they had already boys, for instance. So the consequence of that has been that the number of boys born in India is 120 compared to 100 for girls. So there's an inequality now, an imbalance between the number of boys and girls. So the number of men looking for a wife. And this is one of the background elements of the current violence and rape culture in India towards women. So the first ecofeminists in India, Vandana Shiva, but also ecofeminists in Latin America, made a profound criticism of the way science is used in our societies. And science is used in favor of those with power and in favor of males compared to science used and linked to the body of women. And this scientific, so-called scientific approach was called scientific, but it was part scientific, but part very technological and linked to the way our society sees everything in function of having profits, making profits. So Vandana Shiva speaks about the technocratic and patriarchal system. And I would add to that a capitalist system, because it's in order to obtain profits that the whole economy is working. And the ecofeminists were also seeing that the women in the third world, with the movement against the deforestation of the Himalayas, but mainly in Latin America, where the indigenous peoples, under the impulse and the energy of women, were trying to care for their environment, to care for a healthy environment in agriculture, to have healthy food, and to be able to live according to the old traditions in a kind of symbiosis with nature. You had indigenous people, and you still have them less and less, but you had them in the Amazon caring for the river system and for the fish as a main protein source. So ecofeminism is, in the first place, a very strong criticism on the capitalist, profit-driven, technological and scientific structures. In the science, it goes very far. For instance, the testing of medicine mostly is done with males, young males, and not on women. A lot of medicines are not studied before being applied to women equally as to men. So there is a male bias in the whole scientific community and the whole scientific structure, which is linked to the profit bias.
Marijke, I think, you bring it into context there with obviously the science, and obviously you used to be a biologist right after you studied your degree and you went off into the world and you started work as a scientist focusing. Was that purely on ecology?
I studied, in fact, biochemistry and molecular biology. So my first job was a research job, studying a kind of special cancer in the kidneys of little children. But after a period of that research, I had to stop because I had a serious car accident. And so I stopped. I had 6 months of reconvalescence, and then I started teaching in secondary schools, and I loved it. So luckily for me, I loved the teaching. And since then, I have been studying more and more on ecology, because that's become for me the main focus in educating young people.
How did your standing evolve exactly? Or how did ecofeminism come into your life?
I'm very old. I'm born in 47. So 1971, I started working. In my first interview with my professor for that research project, he asked me the question, "Are you going to marry?" I said, "Sorry, it's nothing to do with the project I'm asking you a job for." "Oh, yes, but if you are going to marry, you will have children, and then you will have to stop doing your scientific work. And a woman always, when she has children, puts the children first and the job in the second place. So I don't want a woman who is planning to have children." That was the first shock. And my second shock was when I entered the staff room in my first school. An older, very patriarchal history teacher asked me, "Is it Madam or Mrs.?" So I was quite brutal, and I said, in answer to that, I said, "Sorry, I've done it already. I am not free either." So then he shut up. The first confrontation with average and daily life sexism was a shock to me, because as a students, we were biology students all together, a mixed group, and we thought that we were really equals, and we behaved like that more or less. But if you look into it later on, you see there was already inequality. But at the same time, being a student, having a project for your life as a professional makes it irrelevant if you are a woman or a man in that kind of studies. So we were not concerned with it. So in 1973, there was a Flemish Women's Day, which was always on the 11th of November, and I went there. So there I discovered the whole complexity of the topic. And one of the major problems in Belgium we had at that epoch was the question that contraceptives were not allowed. And if they were allowed, they were kind of secret. They could not be publicized in pharmacies and so. And abortion, we didn't talk about it. Abortion was completely forbidden by a law dating from the 19th century. So that was one thing. The other thing was that more and more women were working outside the house in the 70s because there was still a high economic growth. And women's wages were much lower than men's wages. It was considered normal because you're a woman. So wages in mainly female professions still are today lower than wages in male professions. The fight for equal pay for equal types of job started in the 70s, not only in Belgium, there was a big factory strike for that, but also in England, for instance. So equality in the working conditions and in wages, together with the reproductive rights, were the main topics on which I was really interested. And it took me then a few years to start participating in a women's group, discussing all those things.
I think, there's nothing equal, as you say, going on there. And I think that's what I liked, about what you were saying about the leading Indian philosopher, Vandana Shiva. So let's go back to that, because I think, she joined the movement very, very early on because she had a very specific role to play in shaping, the eco-feminist vision. She's obviously written over 20 books. And we're going to talk more in the second episode of this series about her seeds activism in episode 2, that's in January. But for today, I'm kind of more interested in the fact that she denounced the demographic policies that designate women as responsible for overpopulation, which you were talking about when you were saying about the feticide back in the sort of late 70s and early 80s. And, this seems to be a real topic of conversation right now, especially after the release of Eco-Hero, David Attenborough's new film, A Life on Our Planet. And I think I speak for myself and the majority of people, at least, when I say that we all absolutely love David. I personally have literally worshipped some of his work over the years. I think, his new film on Netflix, everyone was kind of, on tenterhooks waiting for it to come out. And I only watched it a few weeks ago, but he does do exactly that. He blames or highlights the fact that the increasing population is the main factor causing climate change, which feels a little bit disappointing. So what are your, I know that, Vandana has a very strong standpoint on it, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, the figures, he gets it wrong. 10% of the richest people of the earth consume 50% of the resources. Rich people consume more electricity, they have bigger cars. So that's one thing. The social inequality is not counted on. Secondly, we have seen that the demographic exponential growth everyone in the mainstream media feared for in the 1970s has not come true because women got more and more education. And when women are educated, they choose for contraception. So the global world population is not growing exponentially anymore. And secondly, the population growth in China, where you had this obligatory one-child policy, has been abandoned. But even before it was abandoned, you could see that women were not choosing to have more children. So women were choosing children because of, in the context of concrete material life. And if having 10 children you cannot pay for that, then you don't choose them if you have contraceptives. And you see now, even in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, like Nigeria, when women get the possibility to choose for less children, they choose less children. And we see it also, in France, for instance, where you have good childcare and you have good social benefits for your childcare. There, more women have children than in any other part of Europe at the moment. So it's to do with your life project and your material circumstances. It's not that it's a kind of racist attitude that in the third world those people are growing and multiplying like rabbits. It's this image, and that's wrong, completely wrong. So I think that the population bomb is not a reality at all. It does not mean that we don't have overpopulation problems, mainly in the mega cities. in the third world. If you see, I've been several times in Manila, the capital of the Philippines. They estimate about 14 million people are living in that conurbation, Manila and surroundings. There, of course, there is overpopulation. Poor people are coming from the countryside because they don't have education, they don't have healthcare, they don't have transportation in the countryside. So they go to the city in order to have a better life. And that's one of the main problems in the third world countries, but also in a city like London or like Paris. I can't stand living in this kind of concrete deserts full of people who are rushing around. It's not very human. So I would say overpopulation, yes, in certain circumstances, but that's not due to the fact that people have too many children. It's due to the fact that the countryside is destroyed.
I mean, clearly, there is only one way, as you just directly said previously, is that, the crisis of overpopulation is going to get solved by education globally. But that is something that, as you said previously, that you have been doing, but you weren't actually allowed to talk about abortion or mention the word contraception when you were teaching in Belgium.
No, I couldn't until 1974. Then I could include contraceptives in my biology course. But I did it before that already. I said to my children, look, this is not legal, but I'm prepared to go in prison for that. They were laughing. But we had in the 1980s several trials for all those kind of things in Belgium where I had to stand in court. Luckily, my school supported me, my director. But yes, talking about contraception means also talking about sex with children. And some conservative people and scared parents think that if you talk sex, your children are going to get sex. Of course, they have it anyway, without education on sex or with. So you are just ignoring the problem. Now, education, sex education means also education on the woman's body. And on what does it mean to have sex? It's the best education against the rape culture, which is also present in many countries. Because Belgium was traditionally a country with a very strong Christian democratic parties, and also the Catholic Workers' Women Organization said, look, abortion is a personal choice. Is sometimes a very social problem. We want it to be free so that people can have that choice. And nobody's obliged to have an abortion. With that point of view, they influenced the main Christian democratic parties so that they abstained in parliament. And we could get a law that passed thanks to the liberals, the socialists and the Greens. But it took that long time because of that opposition by a very strong institution, the Catholic Church, which controlled in the north of Belgium 80% of secondary schools and nearly all hospitals. So we were obliged to invent new methods to help women. So we founded abortion clinics and centers independent from hospitals and with a feminist practice. And that still continues now in a very good framework. The amount of abortion in Belgium was estimated at 40,000 cases per year. We are now at 20,000 cases per year for 11 million people, which is one of the lowest in the whole of Europe, thanks to sex education and availability and the fact that it has disappeared as a taboo subject and as a controversial subject. But fundamentalist Catholics can be a very big obstacle for changing things, not only in the heads of the people, in their ideology, but also in practice. And I think that's still the case in many Latin American countries.
Tell us a bit about your work there, because obviously you're saying that sex education works, this kind of idea of talking more to women about contraception, and obviously these, communities are quite willing to go down that road once they actually know about these things. So, you've done a lot of work there educating women in indigenous communities, particularly in the Philippines and Latin America. So tell us a bit more about the kind of work that you were doing there.
The Philippines, as well as Latin America, have a Catholic tradition. So the Catholic tradition is the only religion in world history which has always strongly considered abortion as murder since the Roman times. So the Catholics had a very strong stand on that. And so abortion was a sin. It was put formally into laws in the 19th century. Before that, it was something hidden, done by women unknown to society. But abortion became a very strong taboo in the 19th century, let's say, with the Victorian morale coming up. The morale meant that women had to be at home, obeying their husbands and doing what they wanted. So in that sense, the new morals of the 19th century strengthened the anti-abortion laws in many countries, just like laws against homosexuals and so on. And in Belgium, we started with family planning centers in the whole of the country in the 1960s. Family planning meant that the question of planned parenthood, children who are desired and planned are more happy than unwanted children. That was the main idea. So those centers for family planning became quite successful and became also one of the resources we had to build up a women's movement. Many women had been active there and became member of discussion groups and consciousness raising groups. And through those groups, who became a network, we built up a very strong pro-abortion, pro-choice movement, which mobilized for 20 years, from the 70s till the 90s, to have the law changed. And even today, we see how difficult that remains, because there is a large consensus in society and amongst all the parties except the extreme right and the fascists to liberalize the law today, because the law allows you to have an abortion up to the 12th week of pregnancy. Now we want that to enlarge it to the 18th week, because about 500 women a year cannot have an abortion in Belgium for that reason. So have to go to England or to the Netherlands. And that's socially a discrimination. So we want to abolish that limit and to make it a limit on 18 weeks.
So with the multiple oppressions within the capitalist global economy against women, would you say that patriarchal oppression is inextricably internally related to the destruction of nature?
I would say yes, because it's a question of how do you relate to something exterior to you. Women are exteriors to the patriarchal, male-dominated society. They are a foreign element. They are assimilated with nature. And nature is exterior to our technology, so-called. Now, the COVID crisis and the climate crisis show that this is not true. What happens to nature and to our planet is influencing our lives and the way we organize human society already very strongly. So the climate crisis shows it. So the split between, on the one hand, nature, and on the other hand, science and technology, or the split between women, nature, and man, science and technology, that split should be overcome. And it can be overcome because it did not exist, at least not in that way, before capitalism. Before capitalism, you had another way of doing agricultural activities. You had another link between cities and countryside, and you had another link between, let's say, your knowledge of the real world and your life. Today, they will say knowledge of the real world means science and real life means jobs in the economy. Now, that's not a good description, because your real life of every person, but especially women, feel that your real life is a combination of all kinds of factors. You have your job. Most women in the rich countries like Belgium, most women, 85% of women have jobs outside their family. But their life is so much richer than that, because they have the burden sometimes, but also the nice responsibility for caring for their families. At the same time, if you have shorter work weeks, that's what we aim also at, you can have the time for personal, individual development and creativity and so on. So your real life as a person should be a mixture of productive activities, caring activities, and relations with nature. So that's what ecofeminists are trying to do. Now, what I saw in the Philippines, I went several times to the big island in the south of the Philippines. That island is named Mindanao. That's a less developed part. There's still some original forest there. I saw some ape families, monkeys in the forest there. It's a wealthy tropical region, mainly inhabited at the coastal parts, because it's quite high volcanic mountains in the center. But in that part, nature still exists. Quite impressive. Why? because there is a guerrilla warfare on all kinds of ethnic conflicts. Due to that guerrilla warfare, there's also a very strong intervention by the army, Duterte, and there's an American base. So the big logging companies and the big agrochemical companies don't take the risk to go there, so-called to develop it. That means to destroy it. Destroy it for the tropical woods, destroy it for all kinds of monocultures. There is pineapple, there is bananas, there is all kinds of fruits we know that grow most faster in monoculture in plantations. But those plants have still to be implemented, so they are blocked at the moment due to the internal conflicts, luckily. But there I saw in the villages how communal structures, there's small communal structures in each village, are led by women. Women are active in a lot of NGOs also, and are making educational sessions, helping women farmers to get up their organic farms. They are very, of course, involved in healthcare and provisions for contraception and so on. So you see that women, out of necessity, because to make their lives, to fill up the potential of their lives, they need those provisions. They need to have healthcare. They need to have schools and so on. And they are very, very active. Also at the level of the farmers' union.
How is that destruction, that kind of oppression and destruction, intrinsically linked now? You know, like at this moment in time, what are the kind of main themes that are driving forward this kind of uprising of ecofeminism that we're seeing?
Well, I think one of the main motors of that is in the fights of the indigenous people. The indigenous people, as well in North America, as in South America, as in countries like the Philippines and India, the indigenous people are fighting for their survival because their habitat, their ecosystems are being systematically destroyed. So what Bolsonaro wants to do in the Amazon is destroying the life of thousands of people and the way of life and the whole ecosystem in which they thrive. So the indigenous people were the first who organized in mass organizations to block that. Because it's their survival. It's not only about an ecological idea. It's about survival. It's about culture. It's about the way you can relate to nature. It's a very deep feeling, and that's being destroyed. And the destruction is terrible.
Once upon a time in Ibiza with Joanna Ruby.
Ask the water, ask the water. Ask the water for the female force at the heart of this island, that force which vibrates from beneath the warm sandstone beneath your feet and erupts through fields of red earth to bring you the fat figs and pomegranates that sit in the palm of your hand. Ask the water. If you're looking, really looking for the goddess that the Phoenicians named Tanit when they landed their ships here 2 millennia ago and felt a strange safety yet also a dark exotic power, ask the water. If you take the road less travelled, if you walk inland into the deep valleys and crevices of Ibiza, into her pine-forested folds, you will find the ancient wells, doorways, portals into the island's underbelly, openings to the secret waters that flow beneath and to the forgotten story they have to tell. You see, Ibiza's wells have an urgent story to share about what happens when we stop honouring the life-giving waters of a place, about what happens when we turn away from the old goddesses from within and start worshipping new gods from without. Here at these curved stone wells you will find traces of old paintings, lines and shapes drawn in red, a map leading us backwards to the island's old religion, one that dealt with plants, earth, seeds, the cycles of the year, the wax and wane of the moon, its dance with the sun, and the endless pushing and pulling of water. Ask the water, ask the water. Ask the water why the wells of Ibiza have gone dry. And perhaps they will tell you that the people here forgot that God is a woman, and the people stopped worshipping her, because the island of Iboshim became Ibiza, because God became a DJ. And around this new DJ god there formed a new kind of worship, one which happened far away from the wet, soft, fertile interior of the island, away from those shaded woodlands where the moss grows all year. Ibiza's new DJ god united with the almighty sun god, and they brought their worshippers to the outer land, to the beaches. Here a concrete empire was built to host this new annual pilgrimage to the island of dance. Ask the water, ask the water, ask the water how she felt to be sucked away from the red fields, the orchards and the stone-walled terraces, into the swimming pools and plumbing of this sprawling concrete empire. Ask the water how she felt when the only river went dry. Ask the water how she felt when the wells became forgotten because their life force had gone. And meanwhile, somewhere else, God is a DJ. He commands the turntables as his face commands the roadside billboard posters. His iconography has built him a mountain of gold. And the seasons here no longer revolve around the moon. They revolve around him and his new creed. And in his temples the water they sell comes from other continents in plastic bottles. And around the temple grounds the wells have all gone dry. So if you're seeking a story that is both very old and very new, about what happens when money tries to win over plants, earth and seeds, go to a well and ask the water. The waters know that new gods and golden empires come crashing down with time. The waters know that in them the greatest power always flows.
When the Amazonian forest is cut, then you can use it for 10 years to raise cattle, mainly veal, for export. And that cattle, when that's gone, you don't have any tropical soil anymore because the soil has been depleted. You are left over with this kind of hard, reddish ground soil, which is not fertile at all anymore. It's really destroyed. And that vision, you can also see it now in the old European forests. So the former Eastern Europe regions, like the Ukraine, is the main exporter of illegally logged woods in Europe for the very short-lived kinds of furniture we buy in IKEA and so on. So let's say the indigenous people in Latin America were the first big impetus for ecofeminism. And they also developed a kind of vision, a spirituality, which has nothing to do with a theistic religion, but a spirituality which means you, yourself, your community, and the universe. And they call it, we live on Mother Earth, they call it Pachamama, Mother Earth, which is the source of all wealth, and we have to care for it. So the question of caring for the ecosystem also appeared very clearly in the women's tree hugging movement in India. There were villages on the slopes of the Himalaya. Slopes of the Himalaya were very, very nice forests. They had become nationalized by the colonial imperium of the British. So it was declared national property. And after the independence, it remained like that. But the last 40 years, privatization took place because the army, who was in fact managing those forests, privatized it and sold it bit by bit. So on the slopes of the Himalaya, at certain moments, you had villages living in symbiosis with the forest. For instance, when you cut a tree, you plant a tree somewhere else to replace it, and you pray for the wood, excusing yourself, apologizing yourself for having taken that tree, but explaining why. Those villages had, of course, were a bit aside of the capitalist development. And what we saw in those villages was that more and more men got jobs in plantations, in agribusiness. managing machines and managing that agrobusiness, whilst the women stayed in the villages. So when the army came and with companies to start cutting trees, the women opposed themselves with their bodies physically against the cutting of those trees. They hugged the trees, and the military and the men were so scared of that they left. So they won several times thanks to this kind of tactic. But it also shows visually how this struggle against the multinationals' agrobusiness was desperate. You had to fight. So the women on the Himalayan forests had to oppose themselves physically to these incursions by the army and by private logging firms in order to continue to live in the communities where they lived in. And they were the basis of that society, because the males had gone to plantations to earn money instead of earn a living. A material ecofeminism evolved. Many of those women would not consider themselves as feminists because the label feminism has become white, middle class, wealthy suburban women, which it should not be, because feminism means defending and comparing what the women are in society with what men are in society. That's equality and autonomy. So I would say the label feminism doesn't matter, but we consider that as the feminist aspect is a strong aspect in the whole of the eco-socialist or the ecological considerations you can have concerning the state of the planet and our communities. So it's at the same time taking care of the ecosystems, the natural systems and the agricultural systems you're living in, and taking care of your position as women, and in relation also to your responsibilities, which are socially determined for the elderly and the children.
Do you think by greening feminism, there's a risk of naturalizing it?
Yes, that's of course the whole debate. Some ecofeminists would say that all males are dominant and destroy nature, by nature, being males. I don't agree with that. So I don't agree also neither with the idea that a woman has, by her own biological nature, a stronger link to the natural environment. I don't think it's a biological question. It's the question of socialization of the babies. Once a child is born, and even before with pregnancy, when the woman knows the sex of the baby, this already conditions the response of the mother and probably the father towards how that child will behave. So it's a very deep conditioning we are living through as parents when we have children. It makes a difference when you're a girl or a boy. It's not only the color of the first clothes, but it's also the whole role play, the whole psychological construction. Young children before school age are much more equal, much more difficult to differentiate between boys and girls than when the school has started. Then the conditioning, the beginning of all evil. Your identity as a woman or as a man is not biologically determined, because we are amongst the great apes with the best communication skills. So what a baby does in his first instance of life is looking. And when you see studies of very young babies, you see to what kind of object or person they relate to by looking at their looks, how they look at something. The longer they look at something, the more they find it interesting. So the relationship, the visual relationship already determines how you will evolve as a human being.
The way we are born as humans is clearly not what shapes us. And that beautiful innocence and unfiltered kind of, way that we come onto this planet is, massively changed, obviously, by everything that unfolds once we make our way in this world. I think, what are the similarities between how ecofeminism came up and how it's actually relevant now?
It's more and more relevant because you see in practice that the movements, the ecological movements to protect nature or to oppose destruction of nature, and the movements against the climate crisis are led by women. The young people who mobilized worldwide in 2018 for the climate strike, The young people who are still mobilizing to end all kinds of polluting activities are led by young women. It's not an incident. It's because young women are becoming more and more self-conscious and stronger. They are also stronger because they use all their education skills to mobilize and to structure that movement. So I think it's linked to the way we are socialized, and we will see more and more women becoming at the center of the movements, leading the movements. Not yet inside political parties, although you have several prime ministers at the moment, and you have a lot of important Greens leaders who are women. On the other hand, we have known Margaret Thatcher, we've known Indira Gandhi, we've known all kinds of horrible female dictators. So it's not that womanhood makes us better. I don't agree with that. But it's the socialization and the way at the moment you see it. The result of all that is indigenous people and young people are very often women in resistance against the destruction of nature. And also in the corona crisis at the moment.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think Greta Thunberg and the kind of work that she is doing is very, very relevant. I mean, she's so young, but she's just so powerful. Her voice has reached, global leaders across the world. This is an incredible thing. And, I think if anybody's, kind of an activist on this scene, she definitely needs to have a little mention.
I would say strong women have played a role in history all the time. So you have the Tsarina Katrina the Great, you had the Empress Maria Theresia of Austria, you also had a very powerful indigenous peoples leaders, women. Women have proven through history, Elizabeth I in the United Kingdom, there have been women who were showing that it is possible for women to have brains. And so in those societies to have power. But also today, we had some very strong women in the 20th century, but we also had the thousands and millions of unknown women at the grassroots, the women who mobilized for demands and who realized their purpose.
Wouldn't it be interesting, though, to see all of those strong women's families, their familial makeup, and see, what kind of environment they grew up in? Because, I don't think often these very strong women are growing up in a kind of, patriarchal kind of family. They're very much supported by their mothers. They have a very close relationship. I'd love to know what Greta's parents are actually like, because I think that does play a massive role in how, we as women evolve, through the course of time. It's not necessarily something that comes up later on in life, but of course, community connection, listening to podcasts like these, these kinds of ways of shaping people's kind of perception of that is really important.
Yes, it is important. I've known a lot of women workers in factories in Belgium, in the Philips factories, the Siemens factories, and so on, members of the trade union. At the moment that trade unions took up the demands of women, like the demand for equal pay, you see that the unions are strengthened by the growing membership by women. We also organized in the unions women's commissions, women only, commissions who discussed what needed to be done, what the main demands were from the women's side in the trade unions. It's not always the same as the demands put forward by the union in general. So that means the union led by men. So the strengthening of a social organization where women can develop their skills and their potential is crucial for many, many women in history. It's the same in religious organizations. Why do you think nuns are sometimes so very important? Because there are women in a women's group. When women are empowered in different types of organizations, it's the same for most men. But today, I think that the general education of women has never been so high. So illiteracy is still high in certain very poor countries, but also in a country like Portugal, it was the highest illiteracy rate in the whole of Europe during Salazar's time, the dictatorship. It only diminished after 1974, the revolt against the Salazar dictatorship and revolution then. So if women get the chance and they can organize collectively, then they are strong. And that makes the link again with organic ways of thinking, not only functional in function of a mechanism that produces something. No, it's a function of the well-being of the community. And there women with their social skills can flower and develop their potential.
I think you'd be quite proud of the scene that's going on in Ibiza at the moment, because it feels like a really big kind of uprising, really, of women who are becoming more activists, I think, on the island, or particularly since I've arrived here. There was a big oil rig that was about to be built off the shores of Ibiza, and there was a massive uproaring, really, of the local community. And a lady called Sandra Benveniste, who's coming onto the show in February next year, she's the director of the Ibiza Preservation, and she just really got a lot of people together to back this movement to actually shut the whole thing down. And people here felt very, very strongly. And I think if you look at obviously what happened in the Maldives, that was an absolute disaster just recently. I mean, we've got these beautiful beaches here, and you look at the photographs of what's happened to sort of paradise over there, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. So I think that was a really strong event in Ibiza's history that was very, very much dominated, I think, by her input into kind of stopping these big capitalist monsters from coming in and really destroying our ecology. And this wonderful network that we have on the island, which I'm sure you've heard of, is this Posidonia, which is like thousands of years old and stretches for thousands of kilometers around the island between here and Formentera. And it's a very, very, very major part of our ecosystem to keep the water here healthy. So that was obviously, seriously under threat. And Ibiza went completely bonkers to support this movement. So that was a really great moment in time. Have you ever been to Ibiza?
I've only been in the mainland Spain and in Barcelona once. But I would say women, like what you mentioned, can really be a driving force, and they will not let down, they will not stop, because this is an oil rig for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and then it's gone, and then everything is destroyed. You cannot reverse the destruction of nature. And that feeling is now very strong, I think. And I think also someone like Naomi Klein, the Canadian, who wrote those books on the destruction of nature and the climate crisis, she says the urgency is so big, we must favor all kinds of blocking actions, blockadia, she calls it. So blocking the development of oil rigs, blocking the pipelines, blocking the sites of destruction of forests, blocking the new coal mines and so on. And there's some successes in those actions. And I think that's the way we will have to do it. And my first big experience with that was in the 1980s in the blockading of the big naval base in the United Kingdom in the south of England, Greenham Common. There was a naval base, and the Americans were in the NATO agreements planning to, and they did, to put their nuclear missiles. At that moment, the peace movement, led by women, decided to block it. And so they surrounded that base, Greenham Common, for 2 years. And what did they do? They started knitting and making songs and telling stories and having campfires. And the military did not know, again, what to do with those crazy women. But that was a fight by women who did not consider themselves at that time as feminists, but they had to do it. And they were doing it for the health of their children and their grandchildren. So they were really having an historical view on the whole thing. And those women influenced, in their turn, the women who had been active in the coal miners' strike against Thatcher. And there you have fighting experiences of very strong, because the coal miners' strike lasted 2 years, 85, 86. And there, the women replaced the man at the picket line because the man were put in prison by Thatcher. So the women had to learn to speak in public, had to learn to organize. And all those skills and the skills developed by the Greenham Common women made the women's movement in Britain very strong. So it's not only a question of individuals being in the forefront, but their help, of course. It's also a question of, again, experiencing things. The first time I ever spoke in public I was shaking like a maple leaf. Now I speak without problem. So you learn that. And women very often were said, men told them always, you can't do that, just make sandwiches.
God.
It's this kind of experiences which has made me strong, because we say, no, I can write an article, I can speak for an academic thing, and so on.
It's just difficult to know where to begin. And, I think this podcast is a great bookmark in the beginning of this story that's about to be told, particularly, locally to the island, and the kind of, infrastructure that we can build as a group to try and, maybe just highlight some of the areas that need a little closer examination, and the things that are happening that, need a bit more support. And there's some amazing work being done here, as I said before. So I'm really excited to have had you as the first guest on this podcast to talk about this and to get the thing off the ground. Have you got any kind of, like, lastly, before we finish, is any kind of, where would you begin if you wanted to kind of create like a little call to action? I mean, we're going to talk about, after we finish, this idea that the Ibiza Preservation has launched a new membership program, which I think is really important for people to get behind, the one organisation that are really trying and actually making a real effort to get together and put some protectional systems in place. But, locally or in terms of the community, like, how would we go about kind of getting everyone together?
I think I would start by making an appeal for women to come together, to have a women's group where all ideas can flourish. And I think preservation of nature or the ecosystem in Ibiza, and preserving local culture and cultural events, and look at education in the schools, that would be the first point for me. But I think building a women's group, because that's a strength you will get if you have a good motivated women's group who like to meet together, who can talk about anything, but who also have a purpose in what they are doing as a women's group. I think that would be, for me, the good starting point.
Thank you so much for coming on to the very first Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast. We're very excited to have this off the ground, and very grateful that you would take the time to join us.
And good luck. We stay in touch. Okay?
Thanks so much, Marijke. Take care.
Bye.
It was the Ibiza podcast of Gang of Witches, hosted by Jo Youle. See you at the next new moon. Until then, take care of yourselves.